The Community Solution is an organization exploring the peak oil crisis. Its focus is on local community-based solutions that reflect the values of cooperation, conservation, and curtailment. The breakup of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s created a major economic crisis in Cuba known as the Special Period.
So we have from 1989 to 1993 a free fall of the economy of 34% of GDP, gross domestic product. When I tell you free fall of the economy, trying to imagine an airplane suddenly lose their engines. It was really a crash.
Cuba lost 80% of its export and import markets. Oil imports dropped by more than half. Buses stopped running, factories closed, electricity blackouts were common, and food was scarce. People almost starved.
In reality, when this all began, it was a necessity. People had to start cultivating vegetables wherever they could.
Over the next decade, Cuba took drastic steps to find solutions. It is the first country to face the crisis that we will all face. The peak oil crisis.
Vamos. 2 years ago, we learned about a concept called peak oil, in which we will find that oil production is sort of reaching a peak sometime in the next few years and will be going down, and that implies basically a major change in our way of life. And what we've discovered is that Cuba, because their own artificial peak oil was imposed on them when the Soviet Union collapsed, is actually a model for what's going to take place in the rest of the world. So we wanted to see if we can capture what is it in the Cuban people and the Cuban culture that allowed to go through this very difficult time without competing over scarce resources. And we think Cuba has a lot to show the world about how to deal with energy adversity, which I think we'll all be facing.
In 1949, oil geologist Dr. M. King Hubbert developed the theory of oil depletion, making the prediction that the fossil fuel era would be very short. In 1956, he forecasted that American oil production in the continental 48 states would reach peak production in 1970. Production did peak that year, as he predicted. In 1974, Hubbert testified to a Senate subcommittee warning of the dangers of declining fossil fuels in an exponential growth culture. The U.S. oil peak in 1970, combined with a crisis in the Middle East, led to severe oil shortages and an economic crisis in the country. Americans experienced record high interest rates, long gas lines, the highest gasoline prices in history, recession, and a declining stock market. Government films were produced explaining the problem.
We were caught by surprise with a crisis that could recur and recur unless the entire country recognized the dangers of a quite real energy shortage. Our industrial progress and economic growth was fired by what many seemed to look on as endless energy. But warning signs were there.
I think it's going to end with everybody changing their habits.
During this time, gas purchases were restricted to every other day, long gas lines appeared, and the speed limit was lowered. President Carter formed a task force, which in 1980 published the Global 2000 Report to the President. The report pointed out that by the year 2000, half of all the oil available in the world would have been consumed. Carter had begun a new energy policy. Tax credits were offered for alternative energy, and wind turbines began to appear on the landscape. But then Alaska's Prudhoe Bay and the oil fields of the North Sea came online. The oil crisis eased and prices dropped. Carter's call for frugality and care was rejected. Ronald Reagan moved into the White House and dramatically cut research and development for alternative energy. It was morning in America again, and the country went to sleep for a generation. But the problem didn't go away, as oil consumption continued to increase year after year. In 1997, petroleum geologist Dr. Colin Campbell wrote The Coming Oil Crisis. 3 years later, he founded the Association for the Study of Peak Oil, known as ASPO, and held the first meeting on peak oil in Sweden in 2002. Dr. Ken DeFay, a Princeton oil geologist, published Hubbert's Peak in 2001, followed 2 years later by Richard Heinberg's seminal work, The Party's Over. In 2005, Matt Simmons' book, Twilight in the Desert, challenged the stated oil reserves of Saudi Arabia. A flood of books and magazines began to appear on the market. 25 books were published in 2004 and 2005, and hundreds of articles in newspapers and magazines. The long sleep of the 80s and 90s is coming to an end, and with no more preparation than in 1970, global peak oil is arriving.
Peak oil is the point in time when oil production reaches its maximum. And that doesn't mean that we're running out. What it means is that we're going to have a continuous decline in production from that point.
Peak oil occurs when a reservoir is about half empty. Reservoir pressure drops to the halfway point, and so less and less oil will be extracted each year. World oil production grew slowly until the 1950s, then accelerated until the late 1970s, dipped for a few years because of the Mideast crisis, and then began increasing again. In a few years we'll hit the ultimate peak when half the world's oil will be gone. Oil production will begin to decline. At the same time, world oil demand will continue to grow, and world population is increasing along with it.
What peaks is not total oil, it's the easy oil to produce. What's left is the less desirable oil that you couldn't get out in the first place very fast. It takes more energy to produce, and a far smaller quantity comes from each well.
Oil is finite, natural gas is finite, coal, uranium, all these are finite fuels. So there's going to be a peak for all of these, and peak oil is just the beginning.
The effect on our culture could be extreme. Our economy and our way of life are based on consuming oil and other fossil fuels. Each person in the U.S. consumes the yearly per capita equivalent of 10 barrels of oil for food, 9 barrels of oil for automobiles, and 7 barrels of oil for their homes. The major use of fossil fuels is for food production.
What peak oil means is essentially a limited supply. World oil discovery peaked in the mid-1960s and has been declining ever since. Right now we're consuming about 5 barrels of oil for every one that we discover. That is an unsustainable amount and can't be continued much longer. But at the same time we have increasing demand throughout the world, especially in developing countries like China.
Now, in 1993, China had 733,000 cars on the road, and by the start of 2004, they had 6 million cars. By the end of 2004, they had 8 million cars. They've convinced people that it's nice to drive.
Well, the whole vision for these developing countries is that they're going to be like America someday, and that the people are going to be able to consume the way that Americans have consumed. But that's not going to be able to happen. And that's not even possible for America. Americans won't be able to consume like Americans today.
Peak oil is unprecedented. We've never become dependent on fossil fuels before in human history, and we've never experienced a peak in fossil fuel production. So we're flying blind as a global community. And so we need examples. We need some sort of laboratory experiment where we can run this and see, what's the best way to do it, what's not so good, and so on. And Cuba provides us with that because Cuba has already undergone a kind of energy famine.
after the Soviet Union, oil import dropped from 13, 14 million tons a year to only 4.
Cuba in the 80s have 90,000 Russian tractors, factories of pesticides and chemical fertilizers we received from the Soviet Union. In 1990, everything changed. There was nothing.
When the deep economic crisis began in the early 1990s, it was a change in our lifestyle. We all of a sudden saw abruptly, in a matter of weeks' time, a huge change. We saw symptoms of malnutrition in children under 5 years of age. We saw pregnant women with anemia. We had underweight babies at birth.
The impact on food scarcity was disastrous. The average Cuban lost 20 pounds by 1994.
We were desperate for everything. We don't care about first world quality standards on any commodity. We just need food. It doesn't matter what you bring, we will buy it.
Without imported fuel oil, it was impossible for Cuba to generate the electricity it needed, resulting in blackouts throughout the country.
Well, we had, at that time, power cuts that lasted for many, many hours, maybe up to 14, 16 hours a day. And this, in a climate such as ours, is very difficult because you do need the fridge so the food won't spoil. You had to cook on a daily basis what you had to eat at that moment because you just couldn't put things away. And it was a very difficult moment.
Power cuts were particularly hard in Cuba's large housing complexes. In a tropical climate, with its heat and humidity, it was difficult to be without the use of air conditioners and fans. Without elevators, people used the stairs. Water was carried up or hauled up the outside of the building using a pulley and rope. When taking a bus, people had to wait 3 to 4 hours. When the bus arrived at work, often there was no power. So even if they got to work and had electricity, there was nothing to do. After work, they'd have to wait another 3 to 4 hours for a bus, and often when the bus arrived, it was full, and they'd have to wait for another one. The government imported 1.2 million bicycles from China and manufactured 500,000 more.
We had to then learn how to use bicycles, and bicycles was distributed all around the country to try to get to our workplaces. Doctors went to the hospitals, on bikes, without any culture of using bikes. It was just political will, that was it. There's no other way.
In 1992, the United States tightened its embargo on Cuba. Any ship that docked in a Cuban port was denied access to the U.S. for 6 months afterwards. Almost overnight, $750 million worth of food and medical supplies to Cuba were halted. A few years later, the embargo was intensified, and foreign businesses working in Cuba were barred from entering the U.S. Cuba's access to foreign capital was crippled.
In the case of Cuba, you try to suffocate a country. You deprive the country of access to financial sources, so Cuba cannot have access to the World Bank or to the IMF for good.
An American dollar reached 150 pesos. And the average salary is like 2 pesos. No? There were people that were making $2 a month. So money was not useful to get stuff. So we end up being like an experiment, no? Like with controlled conditions. Like nothing or very little things can get from the outside, so everything has to happen from the inside.
During the first 5 years of the special period, government food rations kept the crisis at bay. These food distributions guaranteed a minimum level of food to each of Cuba's citizens.
And it was invented when we lost diplomatic relations with the U.S., no more economic relations with the U.S., and in order to prevent hoarding. Okay, so the more people that had more money would just swipe, do away with everything on the counters, and others would go hungry. They invented this ration food distribution system.
With food imports reduced by 80%, the government-supplied food distributions had to be cut drastically.
You have the official state market through subsidies, ration card, which has been shrink to perhaps 1/5 of consumption, from almost 100%.
Now, let's go to this board because I want to show you so you can understand. This is on a monthly basis.
Any one of the Cuban population has granted through this system 3 or 4 weeks of basic consumption according to United Nations minimum level of calories ingestion in a month. To complete the 4 weeks basic level, it could come in the form of subsidized food on your workplace, lower prices, so you pay meals at subsidized prices. So that allows you to pay only weekends or nights meals.
So there might be a week, okay, that you might have to buy extra, purchase extra. It depends also on your consuming habits.